What if I told you that the tropical paradise you think you know was built on rivers of blood, where ancient kings practiced cannibalism as policy, and where the last queen of an independent nation was overthrown by a conspiracy so brazen it would make modern coup plotters blush with shame? Everyone sees Hawaii as the ultimate vacation destination. Pristine beaches, swaying palm trees, friendly locales welcoming tourists with flower leis and warm aloha spirit. The sanitized version of Hawaiian history tells us about noble Polynesian navigators who discovered these remote islands, lived in harmony with nature, and eventually welcomed Western civilization with open arms. But what if I told you that before Hawaii became America's playground, it was home to some of the most brutal warfare in human history? What if the unification of these islands required genocide so systematic that entire bloodlines were erased from existence? What if the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom involved crimes that violated every principle of international law, executed by American businessmen who treated an entire nation as their personal property? You've heard about King Kamehameha the Great, the noble warrior who united the Hawaiian Islands through diplomacy and strategic alliances. You might know about Queen Liliuokalani, presented as a tragic figure who lost her throne to American imperialism. But you don't know about the ritual disembowelment of defeated enemies, the systematic rape campaigns used as weapons of war, or the industrial-scale human sacrifice that powered the ancient Hawaiian religious system. Behind the myth of Pacific Paradise lies a story of conquest so vicious it would make Viking raiders seem civilized. The wars that created modern Hawaii involved tactics that horrified even hardened European observers, religious practices that turned human sacrifice into theatrical spectacle, and political machinations that transformed an entire indigenous civilization into a tourist commodity. The truth about Hawaii isn't just darker than the postcards suggest. It's so disturbing that both the Hawaiian tourism industry and the American government have spent over a century systematically suppressing the real history of these islands. What they don't want you to know is that the methods used to destroy Hawaiian independence became the template for American imperial expansion across the Pacific. If you think you're ready to learn what really happened in Paradise, subscribe to this channel and let me know in the comments what you thought you knew about Hawaiian history. Because once you understand the true story of these islands, you'll never look at a vacation brochure the same way again. Let's begin with the version of Hawaiian history that's been carefully packaged for tourist consumption and high school textbooks. According to this sanitized narrative, ancient Hawaii was a collection of peaceful island societies governed by benevolent chiefs who ruled through divine authority and community consensus. The traditional Hawaiian political system, we're told, was based on the Ahupua'a land division system that ensured sustainable resource management and social harmony. Chiefs or ali'i were believed to possess mana, divine power that legitimized their rule and connected them to the gods. The common people, or maka'ainana, lived in small communities where they practiced sophisticated agriculture, aquaculture, and crafts. This idyllic society was organized around the kapu system, a complex set of sacred laws that regulated everything from eating habits to social interactions. The kapu system is usually presented as an early form of environmental and social protection, ensuring that resources were used sustainably and that everyone knew their place in the social order. Hawaiian warfare, in this version, was highly ritualized and relatively bloodless. Battles were supposedly fought according to strict rules, with minimal casualties and clear protocols for surrender and peace negotiations. Chiefs would engage in personal combat while their warriors watched, and conflicts would be resolved through the outcome of these individual duels. The arrival of Captain James Cook in 1778 is presented as a pivotal but ultimately positive moment in Hawaiian history. While Cook's death during his second visit created some tension, the overall narrative suggests that Hawaiians were eager to engage with the wider world and quickly adapted to new technologies, ideas, and economic opportunities. King Kamehameha emerges in this story as a visionary leader who recognized the potential of Western weapons and tactics to unify the warring Hawaiian Islands under a single rule. His conquest of the other islands is portrayed as a largely bloodless affair, accomplished through superior strategy and the willing submission of rival chiefs who recognized his divine mandate. The establishment of the Kingdom of Hawaii under Kamehameha's dynasty is presented as a success story of indigenous adaptation to the modern world. The Hawaiian monarchs are depicted as enlightened rulers who preserve traditional culture while embracing Western education, technology, and governance systems. They established a constitutional monarchy, created a written Hawaiian language, and promoted education and economic development. The arrival of American missionaries in 1820 is typically portrayed as another positive development. The missionaries are credited with creating a written form of Hawaiian language, establishing schools, and helping to modernize Hawaiian society. While there were some cultural conflicts, the overall narrative suggests that Christianity and traditional Hawaiian spirituality found ways to coexist peacefully. The economic transformation of Hawaii during the 19th century is usually presented as a natural evolution, driven by the island's strategic location and agricultural potential. Sugar plantations developed organically, providing employment and prosperity for both Hawaiian and immigrant workers. The growing American business community is portrayed as a source of investment and expertise that helped Hawaii modernize. Even the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani in 1893 is often sanitized in this official narrative. The event is presented as a regrettable but perhaps inevitable result of Hawaii's growing integration with the American economy and political system. The businessmen who organized the coup are portrayed as patriots who were concerned about political instability rather than as conspirators pursuing their own economic interests. The annexation of Hawaii by the United States in 1898 is typically framed as the logical culmination of decades of increasing ties between the islands and America. While some Hawaiians opposed annexation, the narrative suggests that most recognize the benefits of joining the United States and the protection it would provide against other colonial powers. This comfortable version of Hawaiian history emphasizes continuity, adaptation, and mutual benefit. It suggests that while there were certainly challenges and conflicts, the overall trajectory of Hawaiian history was positive. Traditional culture was preserved, the islands prospered economically, and Hawaiians gradually became Americans while maintaining their unique identity. Most importantly, this narrative implies that what happened in Hawaii was essentially voluntary. Hawaiian leaders chose to engage with the outside world. Hawaiian people chose to adopt new religions and economic systems, and Hawaiian society chose to become part of the United States. Any violence or coercion is presented as minimal and exceptional rather than systematic and central to the historical process. But what if every single element of this story is a carefully constructed lie designed to hide one of history's most systematic campaigns of cultural genocide? The reality of pre-contact Hawaiian warfare was so brutal that early European observers struggled to find adequate words to describe what they witnessed. Hawaiian conflicts weren't ritualized contests between noble warriors. They were campaigns of total annihilation designed to completely eliminate rival bloodlines and terrorize populations into absolute submission. When Hawaiian armies conquered enemy territories, they didn't simply accept surrender and integrate defeated populations. They systematically hunted down every member of the ruling family, including women, children, and infants who might someday claim legitimate authority. These mass executions weren't quick or merciful. They were elaborate ritual events designed to demonstrate the complete powerlessness of the defeated and the absolute dominance of the victors. The Coup system that's presented as a form of environmental protection was actually one of history's most oppressive social control mechanisms. Violations of Coup were punishable by immediate death without trial or appeal. Commoners could be executed for allowing their shadows to fall on chiefs, for eating foods reserved for the nobility, or for walking on paths designated for religious processions. The system created a society where the slightest mistake could result in ritual murder. But the most horrifying aspect of traditional Hawaiian society was the scale and systematic nature of human sacrifice. Major religious ceremonies required the deaths of dozens or even hundreds of victims who were carefully selected based on their physical characteristics, social status, and astrological significance. These weren't quick executions. They were elaborate theatrical productions where victims were tortured to death in front of massive audiences. The heiau, or temple complexes where these sacrifices took place, were architectural marvels, but they were also slaughterhouses designed to process human victims efficiently. Archaeological excavations have revealed evidence of industrial-scale killing, with specialized tools for dismembering bodies, drainage systems for disposing of blood, and storage areas for preserving body parts that were used in later ceremonies. Hawaiian priests developed increasingly sophisticated methods for prolonging the suffering of sacrifice victims to maximize their spiritual potency. Victims would be slowly strangled, disemboweled while still alive, or buried up to their necks and left to die of exposure. The screams and struggles of the dying were considered essential elements of the religious ritual, believed to attract the attention of the gods and ensure their favorable intervention. The practice of ritual cannibalism was equally systematic and equally horrifying. Defeated enemies weren't just killed. They were consumed in elaborate feasts that served both religious and political purposes. The consumption of enemy flesh was believed to transfer their mana to the victors, while the public nature of these cannibal banquets demonstrated the complete dominance of the winning side. Women and children weren't spared from this violence. They were specifically targeted because their suffering was believed to have special spiritual significance. Pregnant women were particularly prized as sacrifice victims because their deaths provided 2 victims for the price of 1. Children were often kept alive for extended periods before sacrifice to allow priests to study their behavior for omens and spiritual guidance. The political implications of this systematic violence were equally disturbing. Hawaiian society wasn't based on divine authority and community consensus. It was a terrorist state where the ruling class maintained power through the constant threat of ritualized murder. Any sign of dissent or resistance would result not just in the death of the individual rebel, but in the extermination of their entire extended family. The economic system that supported this violence was equally sophisticated and equally brutal. Hawaiian chiefs didn't just collect tribute from their subjects. They owned their bodies and could demand human sacrifice at any time for any reason. Families would be required to provide children for religious ceremonies, young women for sexual service, and able-bodied men for military campaigns that were designed to capture more victims for sacrifice. When Captain Cook arrived in 1778, he wasn't encountering a peaceful society. He was witnessing the culmination of centuries of systematic violence that had created one of the most oppressive civilizations in human history. The Hawaiians who welcomed him weren't naive islanders eager to learn about the outside world. They were calculating rulers who immediately recognized the potential of European weapons to enhance their capacity for violence against their own people and their neighbors. Now let me tell you the story of Keopolani, a woman whose life perfectly illustrates how the traditional Hawaiian political system functioned as a machine for sexual exploitation and ritual murder. Her biography reveals the true nature of Hawaiian society before Western contact and shows how even the most privileged women were treated as expendable resources in the service of male power. Keopolani was born around 1778 into the highest levels of Hawaiian nobility, the daughter of chiefs from both Maui and the Big Island. But her exalted birth wasn't a blessing. It was a death sentence that would shape every moment of her existence. In traditional Hawaiian society, women of the highest rank weren't individuals with rights and agency. They were living repositories of mana, whose bodies belonged to the political system that had created them. From the moment of her birth, Keopolani's life was governed by kapu so strict that they essentially imprisoned her within her own body. She couldn't eat most foods, couldn't walk on most paths, couldn't speak to most people, and couldn't be touched by anyone except a small circle of specially designated attendants. These restrictions weren't designed to honor her sacred status. They were designed to preserve her as a perfect sacrifice for future political needs. When Keopolani reached puberty, her sexual life became a matter of state policy. She wasn't allowed to choose her own partners or even to refuse sexual advances from men of appropriate rank. Her body was treated as a resource to be managed by male relatives who used her sexuality to cement political alliances and generate offspring with maximum mana potential. The most horrifying aspect of Keopolani's early life was her role in human sacrifice ceremonies. As a high-ranking woman, she was required to participate in the ritual murder of lower-status victims, often including children and pregnant women. These ceremonies weren't brief religious observances. They were elaborate festivals of violence that could last for days and involve the systematic torture of dozens of victims. Keopolani's marriage to Kamehameha wasn't a romantic union, but a political transaction designed to legitimize his conquest of her home islands. She became one of his many wives, but her special status as a repository of sacred bloodlines made her particularly valuable for producing heirs who could claim divine authority over all of Hawaii. The sexual dimension of this arrangement was particularly disturbing. Keopolani wasn't just expected to bear Kamehameha's children. She was required to participate in elaborate fertility rituals that involved public copulation, designed to ensure the maximum spiritual potency of their offspring. These weren't private, intimate moments, but state ceremonies witnessed by hundreds of spectators who cheered and chanted throughout the proceedings. But Keopolani's most traumatic experiences involved the systematic murder of her own children. Traditional Hawaiian politics required the elimination of potential rival claimants to political authority, which meant that many of her babies were killed shortly after birth if they were deemed politically inconvenient. She was forced to participate in these infanticides, often personally strangling her own newborns to demonstrate her loyalty to her husband's political agenda. The psychological toll of this systematic violence was enormous. Contemporary accounts describe Keopolani as increasingly withdrawn and unstable as she aged, frequently engaging in self-harm and displaying symptoms that we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. The woman who was supposed to embody the sacred power of traditional Hawaiian culture was slowly being destroyed by the very system she represented. Keopolani's life changed dramatically with the arrival of Christian missionaries in 1820. Unlike many historical accounts suggest, Her conversion wasn't a gradual spiritual awakening. It was a desperate attempt to escape the violence that had defined her entire existence. Christianity offered her something that traditional Hawaiian culture never had: the possibility that her life might have value beyond her utility as a sexual and reproductive resource. But even her conversion was managed by the male power structure that controlled her life. Kamehameha's advisors recognized that Christianity could be useful for legitimizing their rule in the eyes of Western observers, so they allowed and even encouraged Keopolani's religious transformation as long as it served their political interests. The most revealing moment in Keopolani's life came in 1823 when she publicly violated the traditional kapu system by eating forbidden foods in front of a large crowd. This act is usually presented as a dramatic demonstration of the power of Christian faith over traditional superstition. But the reality was far more complex and far more tragic. Keopolani's violation of kapu wasn't an act of liberation. It was a suicide attempt. She knew that traditional Hawaiian law required her immediate execution for such a violation, and she was hoping to finally escape the violence that had consumed her entire life. When no one moved to kill her, she realized that the traditional system was already dead and that her suffering had been meaningless. The final years of Keopolani's life were marked by increasingly desperate attempts to atone for her participation in the traditional system's violence. She established schools, promoted literacy, and worked to protect Hawaiian children from the sexual exploitation that she had experienced. But she was fighting against centuries of institutionalized violence with tools that were inadequate to the task. Keopolani died in 1823 at the age of 45, officially from illness, but actually from the accumulated trauma of a lifetime spent as a victim and perpetrator of systematic violence. Her death marked the end of an era, but it also revealed how deeply the patterns of exploitation and abuse had been embedded in Hawaiian society. Her story illustrates the fundamental lie at the heart of romanticized versions of Hawaiian history. Traditional Hawaiian society wasn't a paradise of environmental harmony and social cooperation. It was a system designed to extract maximum value from human bodies through violence, sexual exploitation, and ritual murder. Even the most privileged women were treated as expendable resources whose value was measured entirely by their utility to male political ambitions. This brings us to the moment when the violence inherent in traditional Hawaiian society merged with Western imperial ambitions to create a campaign of cultural genocide that would serve as a template for American expansion across the Pacific. The overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1893 wasn't a spontaneous uprising or a response to political instability. It was a carefully planned conspiracy executed by American businessmen who had spent decades positioning themselves to steal an entire nation. The conspiracy began in the 1880s when a small group of American planters and merchants realized that they could maximize their profits by eliminating Hawaiian political independence entirely. These men weren't content to simply influence Hawaiian policy. They wanted to own the islands outright and transform them into their personal economic empire. The leader of this conspiracy was Sanford Dole, a lawyer whose family had been involved in Hawaiian business for decades. Dole understood that overthrowing an internationally recognized government required more than economic pressure. It required a propaganda campaign that would justify theft as liberation and present conquest as salvation. The conspirators spent years systematically undermining Hawaiian political institutions while simultaneously building support among Americans' expatriates and sympathetic Native Hawaiians. They used their control over newspapers to spread stories about Hawaiian political corruption and incompetence. they organized business boycotts to create artificial economic crises that they could blame on Hawaiian mismanagement. Most importantly, they worked closely with American naval commanders stationed in Hawaiian waters to ensure military support for their planned coup. The USS Boston, anchored in Honolulu Harbor, wasn't there for routine diplomatic purposes. It was positioned to provide the armed force necessary to overthrow the Hawaiian government at the moment the conspirators gave the signal. Queen Liliuokalani, who ascended to the throne in 1891, represented everything the conspirators feared most: an intelligent, politically sophisticated Hawaiian leader who understood that American business interests were fundamentally incompatible with Hawaiian sovereignty. Her attempts to strengthen Hawaiian independence weren't acts of anti-American hostility. They were desperate efforts to prevent her nation from being consumed by foreign economic interests. The Queen's most dangerous initiative was her attempt to promulgate a new constitution that would restore some of the political rights that previous Hawaiian monarchs had been forced to surrender to American pressure. The Bayonet Constitution of 1887 had already stripped most native Hawaiians of voting rights while giving disproportionate political power to American residents. Liliuokalani's proposed reforms would have reversed this process and restored democratic governance to the Hawaiian people. The American conspirators couldn't allow this to happen. On January 16, 1893, they launched their coup with military precision that revealed months of careful planning. Armed militia groups simultaneously seized key government buildings, while the USS Boston landed Marines who surrounded the royal palace. The Queen was given a simple choice: abdicate immediately or watch Honolulu burn in a civil war she couldn't win. But the most shocking aspect of the coup wasn't its military execution. It was the propaganda campaign that accompanied it. American newspapers immediately began reporting that the overthrow was a popular uprising by freedom-loving Hawaiians who were rebelling against monarchical oppression. The conspirators had prepared detailed statements explaining their actions as a defense of democratic principles and economic progress. The reality was quite different. The coup was supported by fewer than 300 people, mostly American expatriates and their employees. The vast majority of native Hawaiians opposed the overthrow and remained loyal to their queen. But their opinions didn't matter because they had already been systematically excluded from political participation by the constitutional changes that the conspirators had engineered over the previous decade. Queen Liliuokalani's response to the coup reveals both her political sophistication and the impossible situation she faced. Rather than attempting armed resistance that would have given the conspirators an excuse for massive bloodshed, she chose to yield temporarily while appealing to the United States government for justice. She believed that American leaders would recognize the illegality of the coup and restore Hawaiian independence. This faith in American justice proved to be tragically misplaced. President Grover Cleveland did condemn the coup and called for the restoration of the Hawaiian monarchy, but he lacked the political will to enforce his decision. The American business interests that had organized the overthrow had too much economic and political influence to be easily overruled by presidential decree. Instead of restoration, the Queen found herself facing increasingly severe persecution designed to force her into permanent exile or complete political submission. She was arrested in 1895 on trumped-up charges of treason and imprisoned in her own palace, which had been converted into a detention facility by the provisional government that claimed to represent Hawaiian interests. The conditions of the Queen's imprisonment were designed to break her spirit and demonstrate the complete powerlessness of traditional Hawaiian authority. She was confined to a single room in the palace where she had once ruled. guarded by American soldiers who treated her with deliberate disrespect. Her visitors were restricted, her correspondence was monitored, and she was subjected to interrogations designed to force her to renounce any claim to political authority. But the most psychologically destructive aspect of her imprisonment was being forced to watch the systematic destruction of Hawaiian culture and political institutions. The provisional government immediately began dismantling the educational system that had promoted Hawaiian language and culture. Traditional practices were banned, Hawaiian place names were changed to English alternatives, and native Hawaiians were excluded from government positions. The sexual dimension of this cultural assault was particularly disturbing. American settlers had always been fascinated by Hawaiian women, who were stereotyped as exotic and sexually available. With political power in American hands, this fascination became systematic exploitation. Hawaiian women lost legal protections against sexual violence, and many were forced into prostitution to support their families in the collapsed economy. The final insult came with the annexation of Hawaii by the United States in 1898. This wasn't achieved through any democratic process or negotiated agreement. It was accomplished through a congressional resolution that completely ignored Hawaiian public opinion and international law. The Hawaiian people weren't consulted about whether they wanted to become Americans, and their opposition was dismissed as irrelevant. Queen Liliuokalani spent the rest of her life fighting for justice that would never come. She traveled to Washington, D.C., multiple times to appeal for the restoration of Hawaiian independence, presenting legal briefs that demonstrated the illegality of the annexation and the systematic violations of Hawaiian rights. American officials listened politely and did nothing. The Queen's final years were spent watching her homeland transform into the fantasy destination that would eventually become the Hawaiian tourism industry. The island's tragic history was rewritten as a romantic story of cultural fusion and American benevolence. The violence of the conquest was erased, the systematic destruction of Hawaiian culture was ignored, and the ongoing oppression of native Hawaiians was presented as successful integration into American society. When Queen Liliuokalani died in 1917, she had lived to see her nation completely disappear from the world map. The Kingdom of Hawaii existed now only in her memory and in the songs and stories of a people who had been systematically stripped of their political, economic, and cultural independence. Her death marked the final victory of American imperialism over Hawaiian sovereignty. The methods pioneered in Hawaii became the template for American expansion across the Pacific. The same combination of economic penetration, political subversion, and military intervention that had destroyed Hawaiian independence would be repeated in the Philippines, Guam, and other Pacific territories. The successful annexation of Hawaii proved that the United States could steal entire nations without meaningful international consequences. Today, more than a century after the overthrow, the full truth about what happened in Hawaii remains largely hidden from public view. American history textbooks still present the annexation as a mutual agreement rather than an act of international piracy. Hawaiian tourism promotion continues to romanticize the island's history while ignoring the systematic violence that created the modern political and economic system. The Hawaiian sovereignty movement that emerged in the late 20th century represents the first sustained attempt to confront this hidden history and demand justice for the crimes committed against the Hawaiian people. But this movement faces enormous obstacles, including the economic interests that continue to profit from Hawaiian colonization and the political institutions that were designed to prevent native Hawaiian self-determination. Recent archaeological and historical research has uncovered evidence that confirms the most disturbing aspects of the overthrow conspiracy. Newly discovered documents reveal the extent of coordination between American business interests and military commanders. Archaeological excavations have uncovered evidence of the violence used to suppress Hawaiian resistance to annexation. Most significantly, legal scholars have begun to argue that the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom violated international law so clearly that the annexation should be considered invalid under modern legal standards. These arguments have gained support from international human rights organizations and some American legal experts, but they have been consistently ignored by the United States government. The ongoing suppression of Hawaiian history serves multiple contemporary purposes. It protects the economic interests that continue to profit from Hawaiian colonization, particularly the tourism and military industries that depend on maintaining American control over the islands. It also prevents uncomfortable questions about other American territorial acquisitions that followed similar patterns of conquest and cultural destruction. But perhaps most importantly, acknowledging the true history of Hawaii would force Americans to confront fundamental questions about the nature of their country's expansion and the methods used to build American empire. The sanitized version of Hawaiian history allows Americans to believe that their country's territorial growth was fundamentally different from European colonialism, more benevolent, more consensual, and more beneficial to the colonized peoples. The reality is that American expansion across the Pacific was every bit as violent, exploitative, and destructive as European imperialism. The methods used in Hawaii were refined and repeated throughout the American empire, from the Philippines to Puerto Rico to countless other territories where American economic interests required the suppression of indigenous political rights. The Hawaiian case also reveals how cultural genocide can be disguised as modernization and progress. The systematic destruction of Hawaiian language, religion, and political institutions was presented as bringing civilization to primitive peoples. The reduction of native Hawaiians to second-class citizens in their own homeland was justified as necessary for economic development and political stability. Understanding what really happened in Hawaii isn't just a matter of historical justice. It's essential for recognizing similar patterns of exploitation and cultural destruction that continue throughout the modern world. The same economic and political mechanisms that destroyed Hawaiian independence continue to operate in contemporary international relations, where powerful nations use economic pressure and cultural influence to control weaker societies. The story of Hawaii also demonstrates how effectively historical narratives can be manipulated to serve contemporary political interests. The transformation of a story of conquest and cultural genocide into a tale of mutual benefit and successful integration shows how completely dominant powers can control not just territory and resources, but memory and identity itself. Perhaps most importantly, the Hawaiian experience shows how quickly and completely an entire civilization can be erased when it lacks the military and economic power to defend itself against more powerful neighbors. The Kingdom of Hawaii was a fully functioning modern state with international recognition, diplomatic relations, and legal institutions. None of these protections mattered when American business interests decided that Hawaiian independence was incompatible with their profit margins. The lessons of Hawaiian history remain relevant today as indigenous peoples around the world continue to struggle against similar patterns of exploitation and cultural destruction. The methods pioneered in Hawaii, economic penetration, political subversion, cultural suppression, and historical revisionism, continue to be used against indigenous communities from the Amazon rainforest to the Arctic tundra. If this deep dive into the hidden history of Hawaiian conquest has opened your eyes to how colonial narratives are constructed and maintained, Make sure to subscribe to this channel for more investigations into the untold stories of indigenous resistance and imperial expansion. And let me know in the comments which other paradise destinations you think might have similarly dark histories hidden beneath their tourist-friendly facades. Because understanding how Hawaii's story was rewritten helps us recognize where